Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically to provide you with an update as to what's happening with the disposal of Lukoil's overseas assets. If you've been following this story, you'll know that Lukoil is the second largest oil company in Russia, and it's actually the largest in terms of its overseas assets because Lukoil was the business that decided to start buying lots of assets outside of Russia because it wanted to become a true global player. Now, interestingly, despite the fact that sanctions have been placed against a multitude of Russian businesses and industries, Lukoil and Rosneft, which is the biggest oil company in Russia, both managed to evade sanctions for the first 3.5 years of the war. However, in October, the USA decided that enough was enough, and they placed direct sanctions on both of those companies. And as a result of that, overseas buyers are now reluctant to place any orders. And Lukoil had to sell all of its overseas assets because those companies could no longer accept or receive payments. And the reason why this was important is because those assets are strategically critical to a lot of different countries. Now, we've been through this in previous videos, but just as a quick recap, the biggest assets that the company holds are a 75% stake in one of the largest oil fields in Iraq. They own the largest refineries in both Bulgaria and Romania, so that's critical to oil flows in both of those countries. They've got a 45% stake in the Zeeland refinery in the Netherlands. They own major oil and gas projects and pipelines in Kazakhstan and the Caspian region and have retail outlets in Finland, Europe, and the USA. So they've got fingers in a lot of different pies. Now, initially, the USA gave Lukoil until the 21st of November to dispose of all of these assets, which wasn't very long at all. Now, interestingly, a deal was put forward by a company called Gunvor, which was officially Switzerland-based and had a Swedish CEO. However, that company had historic links to Russia. It was set up by one of the oligarchs. And so it was blown out of the water by the USA. They said that Gunvor was a puppet of the Kremlin, and so they wouldn't allow that deal to go through. Now, the time frame has actually been extended to the 17th of January. And as a result of that, lots of different bidders are now looking at these assets. And they can be classified into three different camps. The first group of bidders are the oil majors, so ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, BP have all been linked with looking at these assets. The second group are state and national players, so basically the governments of the countries where these assets are owned, because in places like Romania and Bulgaria, where they need those refineries to actually keep operating, otherwise everything is going to come to a standstill, they are looking at potentially nationalising those assets, just seizing them and then taking over control for the state. And the third group are financial buyers. So Carlyle Group, which is a big private equity company from the USA, MOL from Hungary, IHC from Abu Dhabi, have all been linked to this deal. However, the most likely bid to succeed is a combination of a US-based investment bank called Xtellus and an individual called Todd Boehly, who you may be familiar with because he's a US billionaire who's a seasoned deal doer, but he's also the co-owner of lots of different sports teams, including the Los Angeles Dodgers, the Los Angeles Lakers, LA Sparks, and Chelsea Football Club in London. Now, before we get into the details on that bid, I wanted to talk to you about a very exciting competition that I've decided to run. As you know, lots of people support me on the channel. People send me YouTube super thanks and buy me coffees and sign up as a patron or a member. And I'm really, really grateful for that support. It really does help to keep me going because despite what you've read in the press, YouTube doesn't pay that much. We're not all billionaires making these videos. It is actually a job. And one of the things I wanted to do is come up with something a bit more creative in terms of enabling you to support me in the channel, but also to give you the opportunity to win something really fun. And now I own a property down at the coast. I've got a house which is a stone's throw from one of the most beautiful beaches in the UK. And I've decided to offer that as a prize in a competition. So if you have a look in the link below, it'll take you through to that competition. You can buy tickets for this house, which was recently valued at £350,000, which is close to $500,000. So that's pretty interesting in itself. However, if you're not interested in that house and all the hassle that goes with it, and the fact that it's based in England, you might be watching this in Australia or the USA or Canada or Indonesia or anywhere in the world, then you can take an alternative option of £250,000 in cash, or obviously I can convert that into any currency that you like. So do the calculation, work out how much that is. It's a lot of money. It's £250,000. So if you're interested in supporting me and the channel, please have a look in the link below or look at the QR code on the screen now. That will take you straight through to the competition. Buy a ticket and good luck. Now, as I mentioned, the most likely bid to succeed is the one being put forward by Todd Boehly and Xtellus. And Xtellus is a US investment bank. And you're probably thinking, I've never heard of that bank. And I have to say, I've never heard of that bank either. And I'm working in the world of finance. So if I've not heard of it, it's very likely that you've not heard of it. And the reason that you've not heard of it is because this was actually formed in 2018. It was a management buyout of the former investment banking arm of VTB in the USA. And VTB is one of the biggest Russian banks. Now, this isn't a Russian operation. It's not run by lots of Russians in the USA. It's actually got lots of international staff. I'm sure there might be some Russian individuals working there, but this isn't a Russian consortium trying to buy these assets in a backdoor way. This is a bona fide US investment bank that has all the regulatory sign-off and certification. And Xtellus specializes in doing cross-border deals that are difficult. Often, where there are sanctions involved, they come up with creative structures to try to get around the problems that are imposed by those sanctions. And what they've put forward for this deal is really quite innovative. They're looking to swap shares that are held by overseas investors in Lukoil. So Lukoil, before the sanctions were imposed, obviously it's a US listed entity, and you could buy shares in it. So lots of different financial institutions held shares in the company because it was seen to be a good long-term investment. The oil and gas industry is an attractive industry to put money into. It usually pays quite big dividends, and also the share price can go up. Now, since the sanctions have been applied, those shares are totally frozen. So all of the holders can't do anything with them. They can't sell the shares. They can't get paid any dividends. So nothing can happen. So basically, those assets are now worthless to everybody that's holding them. And we don't know whether or not the sanctions will ever be lifted. They'll only be lifted if the war in Ukraine comes to a conclusion. And who knows when that will be. It might be soon. It might not be soon. It might be never. Nobody really knows. So from the financial institutions' point of view, they're happy to put forward these shares in exchange for some sort of payment in the future. Now, what Xtellus and Todd Boehly are looking to do is buy these assets from Lukoil in exchange for that paper, those shares. And technically, why that is a good deal from Lukoil's point of view is that any deal that is agreed needs to be approved both by the USA and also by Russia. Now, it's very unlikely that the USA is going to approve any deal that involves money moving to Lukoil. And even if it did, all of that cash would be completely frozen. So it would be put alongside all of the other Russian frozen assets, so Lukoil wouldn't see a cent of that money. So there's no real upside in terms of selling the deal from Lukoil's point of view. They could be looking at those assets being frozen forever, so they might never get any benefit from it. And also, there is a real possibility that the USA just says, we don't like that deal, we're saying no to it. And then ultimately what would happen is that these assets would probably be seized by the states. All of the different countries where they're located would probably take them over because they're important to the continued flow of oil in all of those different countries. So from Lukoil's point of view, any deal that's done involving cash probably isn't that attractive. Now, this proposal, whereby they can take back those shares, what that would enable them to do is basically the same as any company buyback. So you may have heard the term company buyback of shares. This is usually when a company wants to reduce the amount of share capital it's got in issuance. So it buys the shares back and then cancels them. And what that does is basically improves the position for all of the existing shareholders because there's less shares. So if you're paying out a dividend, then you might get a little bit more because there's more cash to go around on a smaller number of shares. And it just tidies up your balance sheet and is something that a lot of companies do on a regular basis. So from Lukoil's point of view, there is actually some benefit to cancelling those shares. They can take them back. It basically means then that they don't have to worry about overseas ownership, what's happening with those frozen shares, what might happen down the road if they need to have a vote or need some sort of shareholder approval for maybe a rights issue or something that's going to happen. They don't have to worry about all the shares that are being held in the USA blocking that vote or, all of those sorts of things. So there is a tiny element of upside from Lukoil's point of view. Nowhere near $22 billion worth of upside, which is what these assets were valued by the Gunvor deal. However, realistically, these assets are worth a lot more than $22 billion. Lukoil has invested into all of these assets over the last 30 years. And the thing with oil and gas assets is they don't come around very often. When you've got oil drilling facilities or oil fields that Lukoil owns, you can't just go out and buy them. They are very difficult to get hold of, and they're very complex in terms of negotiating the deals, usually with the country that those oil fields are located in. So Iraq's a good example of this. So these assets are very attractive, highly valuable, and potentially really cash generative. So the reason why Xtellus and Todd Boehly want to buy them is that they can get this at a real knockdown price. Basically, they're buying these assets for nothing. They're exchanging the shares to take over these assets. And what that would enable them to do, once they are owned by Xtellus and Todd Boehly, they would then be able to undertake a secondary sale, because any future sale of these assets would not be subject to sanctions, because once they're owned by a US investment bank, then that US investment bank could then sell them to Chevron or ExxonMobil or BP or Shell or whatever at a fair market value. And the fair market value is likely to be significantly more than the $22 billion that Gunvor was putting forward, because that was basically a fire sale. Now, just before we go on any further today, can I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please smash that subscriber button? It really helps me with the algorithm and also helps to put a smile on my face. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been talking about Lukoil's overseas assets. This is one of the biggest stories that has come out about the Russian economy over the past few months, because Lukoil was the poster child of the oil industry in Russia. It was seen as being the adventurer that was going overseas and taking over the world. It was really the only global player that had assets outside of Russia. But unfortunately, because of the sanctions that have been applied against the country, all the overseas assets have been thrown up into the air in terms of what's going to happen with them, because they couldn't continue operating as normal because nobody could make payments to Lukoil or receive payments from it. So that was a major problem. So as a result of this, the USA gave the company until the 21st of November initially to dispose of the assets. A deal was cooked up with a sort of pseudo-Russian business that was vetoed by the USA. And loads of other people have now come into the mix to try to buy these assets at a very cheap rate, because it's a fire sale. Russia has no real control over what price will be paid, and also Russia isn't going to receive any funds for it. Now, the deadline has been extended until the 17th of January to give everybody a chance of doing these deals, but it's still a very short time frame for an oil and gas transaction to complete. So it still represents a great buying opportunity for anybody that is able to take over these assets. And in today's video, we've talked about the fact that there's lots of demand, but it's unlikely that any of the deals will be signed off because Russia cannot benefit from the sale of these assets. That is the bottom line. Now, the deal being put forward by the ex-investment bank of VTB, which was Russian but is now called Xtellus, and Todd Boehly, who's a US billionaire investor, a seasoned deal doer, is quite innovative, because rather than giving cash to Lukoil and Russia, it's offering to give back the shares that are held by overseas investors. Now, from those overseas investors' point of view, the reason why they're interested is that they will have a back-to-back agreement with Xtellus that as and when these assets either start generating some income, or more likely when they do a secondary sale to somebody who actually wants to take long-term ownership of them, they will generate cash and they will give money back to those original shareholders in exchange for giving the shares in the first place to facilitate this deal. So it's win-win from those shareholders' point of view, because at the moment, their shares are completely frozen, they're worthless, they're never going to get paid any dividends, nothing is going to happen. So basically, you could just write off your full investment. By doing this deal, the shareholders get a chance of actually monetizing those shares. They're selling them basically in exchange for future upside on the sale of these Lukoil overseas assets. So that's good news for the shareholders, but it's also good news for Xtellus and Todd Boehly, because these deals will be done at a very low price, because Lukoil doesn't have any negotiating power. It has to basically do something with these assets. It can't keep hold of them because of the sanctions that are in place. It's likely that any governments will nationalize these assets if a deal doesn't go through, because they need them to keep operating. The governments in those countries will at some point seize these assets. So Lukoil wants to get a deal done because it doesn't just want to lose everything for zero value. Now, the deal that's been put forward, whereby they're going to get these shares back, isn't really that attractive, because whilst, yes, they can do a cancellation of the shares and tidy up their balance sheet, and this is something that's done in the corporate world quite frequently, it doesn't really need to do that, because those shares are frozen. So they don't have to pay any dividends to those shareholders because there's sanctions in place. They can't make those payments. They don't have any obligation to do anything, and those shareholders aren't going to vote. So Lukoil could just ignore those shares for the rest of its time. It doesn't really need to buy them back. But the reason why Lukoil is seeing this as the most attractive deal is that it's probably the only one that would be approved by the USA. There's no real value in those shares for the overseas holders. So by allowing this deal to go through, the USA would be enabling all of the different institutions that are holding Lukoil shares to get some monetary value. So that's beneficial to the economies that all of those different fund managers operate in. So there is some benefit on that side of the equation. And in terms of the upside for Lukoil, there isn't really any. So Lukoil is still giving away all of its overseas assets for nothing. It's giving it away for a piece of paper that isn't really worth anything. So the overall impact on Lukoil is going to be hugely negative. It's losing both the revenue stream from these assets and also the long-term value of those assets, of which it's put billions of dollars into growing them and developing them. And oil and gas is a long-term investment industry. You put money in and it takes 20 or 30 years to get all of that cash back out. You know, these are cash generative assets. So this is a disaster for Lukoil, which also means that it is a disaster for the Russian economy, because Lukoil, as one of the biggest companies in Russia, has been paying huge amounts of tax. It also employs lots of Russian people, so they all get paid. They pay tax, they spend in their local economies, and so they're helping with the multiplier to grow all of those different economies. So as Lukoil contracts and makes less profit, it will pay less tax, it will employ less people, those people will pay less tax as well, so that's further tax lost for the Russian state. And all of this is really bad news for both the company and the Russian economy. And what it tells us is that the sanctions are really starting to bite on Russia now. Those direct sanctions that were put in place against Rosneft and Lukoil have probably had the biggest single impact that we've seen in the last 3 years since the war started. So I just wanted to give you an update as to what's happening with the Lukoil sale process, because we've talked about it in previous videos. It now looks like it may come to a conclusion within the next month or so, but it doesn't mean that Lukoil is going to get any benefit from the sale of those assets, and that's bad news for both the company and the Russian economy. So thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. Hopefully you found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. Thank you so much to everyone that's supported me, and don't forget that if you'd like to support me in a more fun way, then have a look at the link below where you'll find my competition to win my house or a £250,000 cash alternative. So please have a go at that if you're interested. Thank you so much to everyone that's already supported me, either through YouTube Super Thanks, Buy Me a Coffee, Patreon or YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership. Really appreciate that support. And here's something to put a smile on your face.